I never imagined that the worst betrayal of my life would come while I was lying in a hospital bed, weak, medicated, and trusting the one person I believed would always protect me. The doctors said the surgery had gone well, but recovery would take time. I remember staring at the ceiling tiles, listening to the rhythmic beeping of the machines, thinking about nothing more than getting home. Home meant safety to me. Home meant stability. Home meant the house I had lived in for 32 years, the house where I raised my son alone after his father walked out with a suitcase and excuses. That house held every version of me, the young, exhausted mother, the woman who worked 2 jobs, the survivor who never asked for help. My son Daniel was sitting beside the bed that afternoon, scrolling through his phone, nodding absently while I talked about the bland hospital food and the boredom of waiting. He looked distracted, restless. I assumed it was work stress or maybe worry about me. I reached for his hand and thanked him for being there, for taking time off, for checking on the house while I was hospitalized. He squeezed my hand and smiled, but there was something tight in his expression, something rehearsed. At the time, I ignored it. Mothers are experts at ignoring warning signs when it comes to their children. We call it love. 2 days later, the nurse came in with my discharge papers, and relief washed over me. I was finally going home. Daniel wasn't there that morning. He had texted that he was caught up in meetings but would pick me up later. I lay there waiting, feeling an unease I couldn't explain. When he finally arrived, he didn't meet my eyes. He rushed through the small talk, insisted we leave quickly. As we drove, I noticed he took a different route, one that didn't lead toward my neighborhood. When I asked him why, he said there was traffic, construction, excuses piled on top of each other. We stopped in front of an unfamiliar apartment building. It was clean but generic, the kind of place you rent when you don't plan to stay long. Daniel turned off the engine and sat there, gripping the steering wheel. My heart started pounding. I asked him where we were. He took a deep breath and said, "Mom, you're going to stay here for a little while, just until you're fully recovered." I laughed nervously, waiting for the punchline. There wasn't one. I asked about my house. He avoided the question. I asked again, slower this time. That's when he told me. He said it quickly, like ripping off a bandage. While I was in the hospital, he had sold the house. My house. Our house, he corrected himself. He said it was the practical thing to do. The market was good. The maintenance was too much for me. He said I should be grateful he handled everything while I was incapacitated. I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. I couldn't even form words at first. Sold it without asking me, without my consent. He explained that he had power of attorney for me, medical emergencies, and that he had used it. He said the paperwork was legal, that the money was safe, that he had plans. He talked and talked, filling the silence with justifications, but all I could hear was the sound of something breaking inside me. That house wasn't just real estate. It was my independence. It was proof that I had survived. I remembered the nights I scrubbed floors on my knees, the mornings I packed lunches with borrowed groceries, the years I skipped vacations and new clothes so the mortgage would be paid on time. Daniel knew all of this, or at least I thought he did. When we got to the apartment, he carried my bag inside, showing me around like a realtor. 1 bedroom, small kitchen, neutral walls. He said he would cover the rent from the sale proceeds. He said it was temporary. He said I should rest and not worry. I sat on the edge of the bed and looked at my hands. They were shaking. That night, after Daniel left, I didn't sleep. I stared at the ceiling, replaying every moment of his childhood, every sacrifice, every time I put his needs above my own. I wondered where I had failed, what lesson I had missed teaching him. I also felt something else growing beneath the shock and grief. Clarity. By morning, the fog had lifted. I realized something Daniel hadn't considered. While he thought I was weak and powerless lying in that hospital bed, he had forgotten who I was before I became just his mother. He had mistaken my silence for submission, my kindness for ignorance, and that was his biggest mistake. I sat up slowly and made a decision that felt calm, not emotional. I would not scream, cry, or beg. I would not confront him immediately. I would let him believe his version of the story had ended. Instead, I began to plan. I reviewed memories, documents, conversations, details he assumed I had forgotten. I thought about the accounts, the signatures, the timing. Most of all, I thought about patience. Real power waits. Daniel believed he had taken everything from me in one decisive move. He believed I was someone who would simply accept it, adjust, and fade quietly into the background of his life. He was wrong, very wrong. What he didn't know yet was that selling the house was only the beginning of a story that would cost him far more than money and teach him lessons he would never forget about trust, consequences, and betrayal forever remembered. The next day, Daniel called early, his voice cheerful, almost relieved, as if he had crossed something difficult off his to-do list. He asked how I slept, if the apartment was comfortable, if I needed groceries. I thanked him politely and told him I was fine. I let my voice sound small, grateful, dependent. He relaxed immediately. He reminded me to rest, said stress would slow my recovery. Before hanging up, he added that the house sale had gone smoothly, that the buyers were eager, that everything was under control. I told him I trusted him. The word trust hung between us, heavy and ironic. After the call, I made myself tea and sat by the window. From the outside, the apartment complex looked identical to dozens of others, rows of balconies stacked like boxes. I watched people come and go, carrying coffee cups, backpacks, grocery bags. Normal life continued. Inside me, something had shifted. I wasn't angry in the way people expect. There was no screaming or sobbing. Instead, I felt alert, awake in a way I hadn't been in years. Betrayal has a way of sharpening the mind. Daniel assumed I didn't know much about the sale beyond what he told me. He assumed I didn't understand contracts or timelines or the difference between authority and convenience. He was wrong. Long before I became a mother, I had worked in administration. I spent years reading fine print, organizing records, keeping copies of everything because I couldn't afford mistakes. Old habits don't disappear just because life gets harder. They wait quietly. I asked him to bring me a folder from the house saying it contained medical paperwork I needed for insurance. He agreed without hesitation. 2 days later, he arrived with a box instead, joking that I was a hoarder like always. I smiled and thanked him. After he left, I went through every document slowly. Mortgage statements, tax records, insurance policies, correspondence, and there it was, exactly where I knew it would be. The deed, still in my name. The house was never transferred to Daniel. It was mine, solely mine. What Daniel had used was a limited power of attorney, one that applied only to medical decisions, not financial assets. He had either misunderstood that or hoped I would never question it. Worse, the sale itself had been rushed, underpriced, pushed through by a friend of his who worked in real estate, someone who trusted Daniel's word more than the law. Someone who hadn't asked the right questions. I didn't feel triumphant when I realized this. I felt sad. Sad that my son had been so careless, so confident in my supposed ignorance. Sad that he thought I was someone who could be sidelined without consequence. But sadness doesn't stop action. It clarifies it. I called a lawyer that afternoon, a woman recommended by an old coworker, sharp, efficient, direct. I explained everything calmly, sticking to facts. She listened without interrupting, then asked for copies of the documents. When I emailed them over, she called back within an hour. Her voice was controlled, but there was an edge of disbelief. She told me the sale was invalid, completely. The buyers could contest, but the responsibility would fall squarely on Daniel and anyone who facilitated the transaction. She asked what outcome I wanted. That question stayed with me. What did I want? Revenge would have been easy. I could have pressed charges immediately, watched panic replace his confidence. I could have demanded the full weight of the law come down on him. But I wasn't interested in spectacle. I wanted something deeper. I wanted understanding, accountability, and a lesson that couldn't be brushed away with apologies later. I told the lawyer to proceed carefully. No sudden moves, no notifications yet. She understood. People like Daniel only learn when the ground beneath them shifts slowly, when they realize too late that what they assumed was solid was never theirs to begin with. Meanwhile, I continued to play my role. I asked Daniel for updates about the money, about the timeline. I thanked him for handling things. I told him how grateful I was that he was taking care of me. Each word reinforced his belief that he was in control. He even started offering advice, suggesting I downsize permanently, hinting that I could move closer to him and his wife. He spoke about my future as if it were something he could rearrange at will. One evening, he mentioned casually that he and his wife were thinking of upgrading their own place. Something bigger, something nicer. He said the house sale had inspired them, that change was good. I listened quietly, imagining the moment when his plans would unravel. A week later, my lawyer called to say the buyers had been notified discreetly. They were upset, confused, demanding explanations. The real estate agent was scrambling. Paper trails were being reviewed. Questions were being asked. Still, Daniel knew nothing. That silence was intentional. Consequences are most powerful when they arrive without warning. I looked around the small apartment again that night. It no longer felt temporary. It felt strategic, a place where assumptions went to die. I realized then that my son had sold more than a house. He had sold his belief that he understood me, that he could predict my limits, and soon he would learn exactly how wrong he was when the truth reached him in a way he could not ignore or escape. Daniel found out 3 days later, not from me, but from a frantic call he received while he was at work. I wasn't there to see his face, but I could imagine it clearly. The sudden stiffness, the forced laugh, the way confidence drains when certainty collapses. He called me that evening, his voice different from before, tight and clipped. He asked if I knew anything about the buyers contacting him, about questions regarding the legality of the sale. I paused just long enough to make him uneasy, then said I wasn't sure what he meant. I reminded him gently that I was still recovering and didn't have the energy for complicated matters. He assured me it was nothing, just a misunderstanding, and hung up quickly. The next morning, he showed up at the apartment unannounced. He looked tired, his shirt wrinkled, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for something he had misplaced. He didn't sit down. He paced. He asked again if I had spoken to anyone, if I had contacted a lawyer, if I had told the buyers anything. I looked at him calmly and said no. I told him I trusted him to handle things. The word trust again. This time, it landed differential. Why? He stopped pacing and stared at me, as if trying to decide whether to believe me or fear me. I asked him why he seemed so stressed. He exhaled sharply and admitted there were some complications. He said the buyers were threatening legal action, that the agent was asking questions, that things had gotten more complicated than expected. I nodded sympathetically, playing the part of the concerned but uninformed mother. I told him I was sure it would work out, that he always figured things out. That reassurance only made him more uneasy. That afternoon, my lawyer called to tell me Daniel had scheduled an emergency meeting with her firm, unaware of her connection to me. The irony was almost painful. She asked if I wanted to attend. I said no, not yet. There was more for him to learn before I stepped into the room. Over the next few days, his messages became erratic, sometimes apologetic, sometimes defensive. He began justifying his decision, explaining how he had only wanted to help, how he thought it was best for everyone. He said the house was a burden, that I couldn't manage it anymore, that he was protecting me. I listened without responding. Explanations offered too early are rarely sincere. They are shields, not reflections. When the legal notice arrived at his home, reality finally settled in. He came to see me again, this time pale, his hands shaking slightly. He sat down heavily and told me everything. The buyers were suing. The agent was distancing himself. His wife was furious. He admitted he hadn't fully understood the limits of the power of attorney. He said he never thought it would go this far. He looked at me then, really looked, as if seeing me for the first time in years. That was when I spoke. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't accuse. I simply asked him one question. Why didn't you ask me? The room went quiet. He opened his mouth, then closed it. There was no answer that didn't expose the truth. He assumed, he decided, he took, and he expected gratitude. I told him I knew everything about the invalid sale, about the rush price, about the friend who facilitated it, about the fact that he had no legal right to sell my house. His shoulders sagged as each sentence landed. He whispered that he was scared, that he didn't know what to do, that he might lose everything. I told him fear was familiar to me. I had lived with it for decades. Fear of eviction, fear of illness, fear of raising a child alone. The difference was that I never solved my fear by taking from someone else. I solved it by working, by waiting, by enduring. He asked me what I wanted to do next. The question carried an unspoken plea: save me, fix this, make it go away. I stood up slowly and told him I would attend the next meeting with the lawyer, not to rescue him, but to clarify the truth. I told him the house would be returned to me, legally and publicly. The rest would depend on his choices. He started to cry then, not loudly, not dramatically, quietly. He kind of crying that comes when consequences are no longer abstract. I didn't comfort him. I didn't scold him either. I simply let him feel it. Growth doesn't happen in comfort. That night, alone again, I felt something close to peace. Not satisfaction, not victory. Peace. Because for the first time since I left the hospital, I wasn't reacting, I was directing. And Daniel, whether he liked it or not, was finally being forced to understand that I was not someone he could override, manage, or erase. I was still standing. And this story was far from over. The meeting took place on a gray Tuesday morning, the kind of day where the sky feels heavy and time moves slowly. Daniel arrived early, according to my lawyer, pacing the lobby like a trapped animal. I arrived 10 minutes later, walking in steadily, my posture straight despite the lingering ache from surgery. When he saw me, he froze. There was shock in his eyes, but also something else, something close to shame. He stood up quickly, unsure whether to hug me or keep his distance. I nodded once and took a seat across from him, calm, unreadable. The lawyer laid out the facts methodically: the limited power of attorney, the lack of authority to sell, the rushed appraisal, the buyer's claim. Each point was presented without emotion, just reality, sharp and unavoidable. Daniel's face drained of color. He tried to interrupt once to explain his intentions, but the lawyer raised a hand and continued. Intentions, she reminded him, do not override the law. When it was my turn to speak, I didn't say much. I confirmed that I had not authorized the sale. I confirmed that I wanted the property returned to my ownership immediately. I confirmed that any financial or legal consequences resulting from the attempted sale were not my responsibility. I spoke clearly, slowly, without anger. The room felt very still when I finished. The buyers agreed to unwind the transaction to avoid a prolonged legal battle. They wanted their money back, compensation for fees and damages for the disruption. Daniel nodded numbly. He would be responsible. The agent, now visibly nervous, excused himself to make calls. The meeting ended quickly after that, the outcome decided. Outside, Daniel followed me in silence to the parking lot. He finally spoke when we reached my car. He asked if I hated him. The question surprised me. Hate is loud. This was quiet. I told him I didn't hate him. I told him I was disappointed, and disappointment lasts longer. He looked down at the pavement and said he never thought I would push back like this. He said he thought I would be relieved, grateful even. That word again, grateful. I asked him when he had started seeing me as someone who needed managing instead of respecting. He didn't answer. We stood there for a moment, the distance between us filled with years of unspoken assumptions. Then I told him something I hadn't planned to say. I told him that selling the house wasn't the worst part. The worst part was deciding for me, removing my agency while I was vulnerable, turning my illness into an opportunity. That was when he looked up, really looked, and nodded. He said he understood now. I wasn't sure if he did, but I could see the weight settling in. Consequences had faces now. They looked like lawsuits, like financial strain, like trust breaking under pressure. Over the next few weeks, the house was returned to me. The sign came down, the keys were mailed back. I walked through the room slowly when I finally returned, touching the walls, the counters, the worn edges of door frames. Everything was exactly as I had left it, and yet nothing felt the same. Spaces remember betrayal, even when they forgive. Daniel visited less during that time. When he did, he was cautious, careful with his words. He asked permission before offering opinions. It was an adjustment for both of us. I wasn't interested in punishment. I was interested in recalibration. He needed to learn that love does not grant control, and concern does not erase consent. One afternoon, he asked me if I planned to sell the house now that everything was resolved. I smiled slightly and told him no, not because I couldn't, but because I didn't want to. Choice matters more than outcome. He nodded, absorbing the lesson. The money he had planned to use for his upgrade was gone, tied up in fees and settlements. His marriage was strained, his confidence shaken. None of that brought me joy. It brought clarity. Actions ripple outward in ways we cannot predict, especially when they are built on entitlement. As my strength returned, so did my routines. Morning coffee in my kitchen, evening walks past familiar houses, conversations with neighbors who asked where I'd been. I told them I was recovering, which was true in more ways than one. Daniel and I began talking again, slowly, honestly. He apologized more than once. I accepted the apology, but I didn't rush forgiveness. Trust is rebuilt through behavior, not words. He started showing up differently, listening, asking, waiting. The house still stands, solid and quiet. It has seen worse storms, so have I. And while this chapter was painful, it did something necessary. It reminded both of us that strength doesn't disappear with age or illness. It simply changes form. And those who mistake patience for weakness eventually learn the difference. Recovery is not only about the body. I learned that in the weeks that followed as my days slowly filled again with ordinary things. Laundry, emails, bills, phone calls. Life returned in pieces, and with it came the quiet space to think. I replayed the events not with anger, but with curiosity. How easily the roles had shifted. How quickly my son had stepped into a position of authority without ever being invited. How natural it had felt to him. That realization stayed with me more than the legal details ever did. Daniel called one evening and asked if he could come by just to talk. Not to F anything, not to ask for something, just to talk. I said yes. When he arrived, he looked different, less certain, less hurried. He sat at the kitchen table while I made tea, the same table where he used to do homework while I cooked dinner after long shifts. Memory has a way of humbling people when they are finally quiet enough to hear it. He told me he had been thinking a lot about why he did what he did. He admitted he had convinced himself that he knew better, that age and illness meant decline, that responsibility had naturally shifted to him. He said he never meant to hurt me, that he truly believed he was helping. I listened without interrupting. When he finished, I asked him a simple question. At what point did helping stop including my voice? He swallowed hard and said he didn't know. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just about one house or one decision. It was about a pattern, one I had unknowingly helped create. I had always been capable, independent, resourceful, but I had also been quiet about it. I had shielded him from my struggles, my strengths, my complexity. I had allowed him to believe that my stability came from fragility rather than resilience. Silence can be generous, but it can also be misleading. I told him that night about things he didn't know, about the years I negotiated raises instead of asking for help, about the contracts I read carefully, the savings I built slowly, the plans I made quietly in case something ever happened to me. I told him I never wanted him to feel burdened, but I also never wanted to disappear. He listened, eyes fixed on the table, nodding occasionally. When I finished, he said he wished he had known all of that. I told him he still could if he was willing to learn now. Our relationship began to shift after that. It wasn't dramatic, no grand gestures, just small, consistent changes. He asked before acting. He checked assumptions instead of building on them. He stopped speaking about my life as if it were a project to manage. In return, I stopped pretending I didn't need boundaries. Mutual respect is not instinctive, even between parent and child. It is practiced. There were difficult moments, awkward silences, conversations that ended without resolution. But there was also something new, honesty, not the kind that wounds, but the kind that clarifies. When he suggested something I didn't agree with, I said so. When I needed help, I asked for it directly instead of masking it as independence. Balance, I learned, is not about doing everything alone. It is about choosing when to share control. The house became a symbol again, but a different one, not just of survival, but of authorship. I repainted the living room. I replaced a broken fixture I had ignored for years. Each small change felt intentional, chosen. When Daniel noticed, he smiled and said it looked good. No commentary, no suggestions, just acknowledgement. One afternoon, a neighbor stopped by and asked if everything was okay, mentioning rumors about a sale that never happened. I smiled and said there had been a misunderstanding, but it was resolved. That was true. Misunderstandings often reveal more than they hide. Daniel's life changed too. He faced consequences that couldn't be smoothed over, financial strain, difficult conversations with his wife, rebuilding trust on multiple fronts. I didn't interfere. Those were his lessons to learn. Support does not mean rescue. Sometimes it means standing back and allowing discomfort to do its work. Months later, when I was fully recovered, he asked if I wanted to add him to any legal documents again. I appreciated the question. I told him not yet, not because I didn't trust him at all, but because trust is rebuilt gradually. He accepted that without argument. That acceptance mattered more than any promise. Looking back, I don't see myself as the victim of the story anymore. I see myself as the author who paused, revised, and continued. The shock wasn't what I did next legally. It was what I did internally. I chose clarity over chaos, boundaries over bitterness. And in doing so, I reclaimed something far more important than a house. I reclaimed my voice fully and unapologetically, and that made all the difference. Time has a way of smoothing sharp edges, but it doesn't erase lessons. As weeks turned into months, the shock of what Daniel had done faded, yet the understanding it created stayed firmly in place. Our conversations grew easier, but they were different now. There was an awareness between us, a mutual recognition that the roles we once assumed were no longer fixed. I was not simply the aging parent to be managed, and he was not the unquestioned decision maker. We were two adults learning, belatedly, how to coexist with respect. One afternoon, Daniel admitted something that surprised me. He said that when he sold the house, part of him felt powerful, not malicious, not cruel, but important. He said handling everything while I was incapacitated made him feel capable, grown, in control. Hearing that hurt more than any legal betrayal. It revealed how deeply he had equated authority with worth. I told him that power taken without consent is not strength, it is insecurity wearing confidence as a disguise. He nodded slowly, as if hearing something he had never allowed himself to consider. I began to notice how often people confuse caring with controlling. Friends shared stories of adult children rearranging their lives for their own good. Doctors spoke to Daniel instead of me until I corrected them. Even well-meaning neighbors assumed my illness had reduced my competence. The world is quick to sideline those it deems fragile. That realization made me firmer, clearer, less apologetic about taking up space again. Daniel's wife reached out during this time as well. At first cautiously, then more openly. She admitted she had supported the sale, believing it was practical, inevitable. She said she thought I would be relieved. I listened and asked her the same question I had asked Daniel. Why didn't you ask me? Him, but because I proved something to myself. I can be vulnerable without being erased. I can accept support without surrendering autonomy. And I can love my son while still holding him accountable. That balance is not easy, but it is necessary. The story didn't shock people because a house was sold and returned. It shocked them because I didn't collapse. I didn't disappear. I stood up calmly, deliberately, and reclaimed what was mine. And in doing so, I taught a lesson that will echo far longer than any legal ruling ever could. There is a strange moment that comes after conflict, when the noise fades and what remains is not anger, but awareness. I found myself in that space more often as time passed. I noticed how differently people spoke to me now, how my voice carried more weight simply because I used it without apology. I hadn't changed my personality, I had changed my posture in the world, and that shift altered everything. Daniel and I reached a new rhythm, one built on mutual caution and growing respect. He no longer assumed my silence meant agreement. I no longer assumed his intentions excused his actions. We learned slowly how to ask instead of decide. That lesson didn't come easily to him. Years of unconscious entitlement don't dissolve overnight. But he was trying, and trying consistently matters. One evening, he asked me something that revealed just how deeply the experience had affected him. He asked if I had ever felt invisible while raising him. The question caught me off guard. I thought for a long moment before answering honestly. I told him yes, not because he ignored me, but because the world expects mothers to disappear quietly into duty. Our work is assumed, our strength is taken for granted. He listened, his eyes fixed on mine, and said he had never thought about it that way. That conversation opened a door. We began talking about expectations, about how roles harden over time if they are never questioned. I told him that love should not require shrinking, that care should not demand silence. He nodded, absorbing words that would take years to fully understand, but had finally heard. I also noticed changes in myself that I hadn't anticipated. I became less patient with condescension, even when it was subtle. When service workers spoke past me, I corrected them. When professionals addressed my son instead of me, I redirected the conversation calmly. Each time I did this, a little more confidence returned. Not the loud kind, the settled kind. There was a day when Daniel offered to drive me to an appointment, then hesitated and asked if I wanted him to. The pause mattered. Choice had entered the space where assumption once lived. I said yes that day, not because I needed him, but because I wanted the company. He smiled, relieved in a way that surprised us both. The story spread quietly among family and friends, reshaped by retelling. Some saw me as resilient. Others saw me as unforgiving. I accepted both interpretat. Ions. People often project their own fears onto stories like mine. Those who fear losing control sympathize with Daniel. Those who fear being erased understand me. Neither group is entirely wrong. What mattered most was the internal shift. I no longer measured my worth by how much I could endure in silence. I measured it by how clearly I could express my needs and boundaries. That clarity changed my relationships across the board. Friends listened more carefully. Family checked in instead of checking over me. Even strangers responded differently when I spoke with certainty. Daniel once admitted that the moment he realized he had truly lost control was not when the lawyers got involved, but when he saw how calm I remained. He said my lack of panic frightened him more than any legal threat. I told him that calm comes from knowing yourself. When you are grounded, chaos loses its power. I also forgave myself. For the years I believed that minimizing myself was a form of love. For the times I stayed quiet to keep peace. Forgiveness does not erase regret, but it releases it. I stopped replaying every decision that led to that hospital bed, to that unauthorized sale. The past had taught me what it needed to. The rest was unnecessary punishment. The house remained, but it was no longer the center of the story. It was a setting. The real transformation happened in conversations, in pauses, in questions finally asked. Daniel grew more thoughtful. I grew more assertive. We met somewhere closer to the middle, where neither of us needed to dominate or disappear. Sometimes when people hear what happened, they ask me if I would do anything differently. I tell them no, not because the pain was justified, but because it was instructive. It revealed truths that comfort never could. It forced growth that avoidance would have delayed indefinitely. I don't tell this story to warn parents against trusting their children or to paint sons as villains. I tell it because it exposes a dynamic many people live with quietly. the assumption that age equals decline, that love equals authority, that silence equals consent. None of those are true, and believing them costs more than people realize. What shocked everyone was not my legal response. It was my refusal to fade. I remained present, vocal, deliberate. I reclaimed my agency without cruelty, my dignity without noise, and in doing so, I changed not only my relationship with my son, but my relationship with myself. As the months settled into a quieter rhythm, I realized that what had happened between Daniel and me had rippled outward in ways I hadn't expected. People began sharing their own stories, sometimes casually, sometimes with surprising vulnerability. Friends confessed that their children had taken over finances to help. Neighbors mentioned being pressured into decisions they weren't ready to make. Again and again, I heard the same thread woven through different lives. Good intentions masking a gradual L. Process of voice. I listened more than I spoke. When I did speak, I didn't dramatize what happened. I didn't frame myself as a victim or a hero. I simply told the truth. I said that love without respect becomes control. And control dressed up as care is still control. Some people nodded in recognition, others grew uncomfortable. Discomfort often signals proximity to truth. Daniel noticed these conversations too. He admitted one evening that hearing others talk about similar situations made him see his actions in a broader context. He said he realized how easily he could have justified even worse decisions if nothing had stopped him. That admission mattered. It showed reflection, not just regret. I also became more attentive to how institutions treat people perceived as vulnerable. Banks, hospitals, insurance companies. The moment someone senses weakness, processes shift. Questions are redirected. Authority is reassigned. I learned to interrupt that shift early, to say, "Speak to me," to insist on being addressed directly. Each time I did, I felt a little stronger, not because I was proving anything, but because I was honoring myself. Daniel's role in my life changed permanently, not in affection, but in position. He was no longer the silent overseer waiting to step in. He was a partner in conversation, someone whose input was welcome but not definitive. That distinction transformed our interactions. Decisions became discussions. Disagreements became negotiations, not power struggles. One afternoon, he asked if I would ever trust him with major decisions again. I didn't answer immediately. Trust is not a switch you flip back on. I told him trust is built when patterns change, not when promises are made. I said I trusted him more than I had before, not because he hadn't failed, but because he had faced the failure instead of running from it. That answer seemed to satisfy him, even if it wasn't the certainty he wanted. I spent more time alone, too. Not out of isolation, but choice. Long walks, quiet mornings, time to think without interruption. Solitude felt different now. It wasn't emptiness, it was spaciousness. I filled it with reading, with reflection, with small pleasures I had postponed for years. I was no longer waiting for permission to enjoy my own life. The house continued to anchor me, but I stopped seeing it as something that could be taken from me again. Not because it was invincible, but because I was no longer passive. Awareness is a kind of insurance. Once you have it, you move differently through the world. Daniel's marriage stabilized slowly. Boundaries were set. Conversations were had that could no longer be avoided. I didn't insert myself into those dynamics. I knew better now. Everyone has to confront their own patterns. Intervention without invitation often recreates the very control it seeks to prevent. Occasionally, Daniel would ask for my perspective, not as a mother dispensing wisdom, but as a woman who had lived, failed, endured, and learned. I offered it when asked. I withheld it when not. That restraint was new for me too. Letting others struggle is sometimes the most respectful thing you can do. What stayed with me most was how close I had come to disappearing quietly. One unchecked decision, one moment of unquestioned authority, and my life could have been rearranged without my consent. That thought no longer frightened me. It motivated me. It reminded me to remain present, alert, engaged with my own affairs, no matter how comfortable life seemed. I began to speak more openly about autonomy, especially with other women, not in grand speeches, but in small, honest exchanges. I told them to ask questions, to read documents, to name beneficiaries clearly, to never assume someone else would protect their interests simply because they loved them. Love does not replace diligence. It must work alongside it. Daniel once said that what shocked him most wasn't that I fought back, but that I did so without cruelty. He said he expected anger, accusations, ultimatums. Instead, he encountered resolve. Resolve unsettles people because it leaves no room for argument. It simply exists. I carry that resolve with me now, quietly. It shows up in how I speak, how I listen, how I decide. It doesn't require validation. It doesn't need witnesses. It is enough to know that I will not erase myself for anyone's comfort again. This story is often framed as a confrontation between parent and child, but that is only the surface. Beneath it lies a deeper truth about agency, about how easily it can be lost and how deliberately it must be reclaimed. What I did next shocked people because it violated an expectation. The expectation that I would comply, that I would fade, that I would be grateful for decisions made over my head. Instead, I chose presence. I chose clarity. I chose myself. And that choice continues to shape everything that came after, long after the house keys were returned and the legal papers were filed away. Looking back, I can see how easily this story could have ended differently, not with resolution, but with quiet erasure. There are countless people who never discover what was decided for them behind closed doors, who accept changes presented as necessities, who adjust without questioning because they are told it is easier that way. I was close to becoming one of them, not because I lacked intelligence or strength, but because I trusted love to protect me. Trust without awareness, I learned, is a vulnerability few acknowledge until it is tested. Daniel and I reached a point where we could talk about the incident without tension, not casually but honestly. He admitted that when he first told his friends about selling the house, he framed it as an act of responsibility. He said people praised him for stepping up, for handling things while I was ill. No one asked if I had agreed. No one questioned the ethics. That realization unsettled him deeply. Approval, he lay. R&D often rewards decisiveness, not correctness. I told him something that surprised us both. I said I understood why he did it. Not because it was right, but because the world often teaches us that taking control is the same as being capable, especially when someone else appears weak. He nodded, slowly, as if releasing a belief he had been carrying without examining. Understanding is not forgiveness, but it opens the door to it. I also reflected on my own role in shaping that moment. I had always solved problems quietly, paid bills without discussion, handled crises without complaint. I thought I was modeling resilience. In reality, I was also modeling invisibility. When people don't see your effort, they underestimate your authority. That was a difficult truth to accept, but an important one. As my health fully returned, so did my sense of future. I began planning again, not out of fear, but intention. Travel I had postponed, projects I had shelved. I didn't announce these plans to anyone. I didn't need permission. That alone felt like a small victory. Daniel noticed the change. He commented once that I seemed lighter, more certain. I told him certainty comes from alignment, from living in accordance with your own values, instead of bending to accommodate everyone else's expectations. He listened carefully. I could see him storing that lesson, not just for himself, but for how he would eventually move through the world. Our relationship now rests on something sturdier than obligation. It rests on mutual recognition. He sees me as a full person, not a role. I see him as an adult capable of learning, not a child to be protected from consequences. That balance required discomfort, but it also created respect that had been missing. There are still moments when old habits surface. He offers advice without being asked. I hesitate before asserting myself. When that happens, we notice. We correct course. Growth is not linear. It is iterative, shaped by awareness and repetition. The house remains part of my life, but it no longer defines my security. I could leave it tomorrow and still feel anchored because the real foundation has shifted inward. Possessions can be threatened. Autonomy, once reclaimed, is harder to take away. Sometimes I imagine speaking directly to the version of myself lying in that hospital bed, unaware of what had been done in her absence. I would tell her not to panic, to breathe, to trust her instincts, to remember who she was before she became small for others' comfort. I would tell her that she would handle it, not with rage, but with clarity, and that clarity would change everything. People often ask me how I stayed so calm. The truth is, calm was not my first emotion. Shock came first, then grief, then something quieter and stronger, resolve. Resolve does not announce itself. It simply moves forward. Daniel once said that the hardest part was realizing he could not fix what he had broken simply by apologizing. I told him that realization was the beginning of integrity. Repair takes time. It requires humility, consistency, and a willingness to be uncomfortable without retreating into defensiveness. He is still learning that. So am I. If there is one thing this experience taught me, it is that agency must be exercised, not assumed. No one, no matter how well-intentioned, should act in your place without your consent. And if they do, responding with clarity rather than chaos is often the most powerful answer. What I did next shocked people because it contradicted the narrative they expected. They expected fear. They expected compliance. They expected gratitude. Instead, they saw self-possession. They saw a woman who refused to be edited out of her own life. That refusal continues to guide me in small decisions and large ones, in conversations and silences. It is not loud. It does not demand attention, but it is firm, unmovable. And it ensures that whatever comes next, it will be chosen, not assigned. There is a particular kind of quiet that comes after everything important has already been said, not the silence of avoidance, but the silence of understanding. That is where my life eventually settled. The drama faded, the tension softened, and what remained was a clearer version of myself and a more honest version of my relationships. I didn't need constant reminders of what happened. The shift lived in how I moved, how I decided, how I responded. When someone tried to step over a line that was now clearly drawn, Daniel began asking different questions, not just about me, but about himself. He wondered aloud how many of his choices had been driven by fear rather than care, by the need to feel indispensable rather than genuinely helpful. Watching him reflect was strange and humbling. Parents rarely get to see the moment when their children confront their own shadows. It is not a neat process. It is uncomfortable and often resisted. But when it happens, it changes the dynamic permanently. I also noticed how the story changed depending on who told it. Some framed it as a cautionary tale about family and money. Others saw it as a lesson about boundaries and aging. A few reduced it to gossip, stripping it of meaning. I stopped correcting people. Stories belong to those who tell them, but truth belongs to those who live it. I didn't need consensus to feel settled. The most meaningful changes were subtle. I stopped explaining myself excessively. When I made a decision, I stated it plainly. If someone disagreed, I listened without yielding automatically. That alone shifted the balance in every interaction. People adapt quickly when they realize access no longer includes authority. Daniel adapted too. He became more patient, less reactive. When disagreements arose, he paused instead of pushing forward. He learned slowly that collaboration feels different from control. It takes longer. It requires listening. But it also builds something stronger than obedience. Ever could? One afternoon, he admitted that he had been afraid of losing me, not physically, but emotionally. He said that when I was in the hospital, helpless and still, he felt the ground shift beneath him. Selling the house, he realized, had been his way of anchoring himself, of creating certainty in the face of fear. I thanked him for that honesty. Fear does not excuse harm, but naming it is the first step toward preventing it from causing more. I shared something in return. I told him that I had been afraid too, afraid of becoming invisible, afraid of being quietly absorbed into other people's plans, afraid that my life would shrink without anyone noticing. That fear, I told him, was what had fueled my resolve. When fear meets clarity, clarity wins. We didn't promise each other perfection. We promised awareness, to question motives, to ask instead of assume, to correct when we slipped. Those promises felt more realistic, more sustainable. The house itself became almost incidental. I could imagine a future where I sold it on my own terms, or where I stayed until I chose not to. The difference was not the outcome, but the authorship. My life was no longer something that happened to me. It was something I actively shaped. I took pleasure in small acts of autonomy, rearranging furniture, planning trips, saying no to invitations that drained me, saying yes to things that excited me. Each choice reinforced the truth I had reclaimed. I was not finished. I was not fragile. I was not waiting to be managed. Daniel's respect showed itself in ways that didn't require acknowledgement. He consulted me without expecting compliance. He supported without directing. He accepted my decisions even when he didn't agree. Those behaviors mattered more than apologies ever had. There were moments of sadness, too, grief for the simplicity we had lost, for the illusion that love alone could protect against harm. But illusions, once broken, make room for something sturdier. Reality, when faced honestly, is a better foundation. If someone were to ask me what shocked people most, I would say it wasn't the legal reversal or the confrontation. It was the restraint, the refusal to perform anger, the choice to respond with precision rather than chaos. People expect drama from betrayal. They don't expect dignity. That dignity became my compass. It guided me when conversations grew uncomfortable. It steadied me when doubts surfaced. It reminded me that strength does not require domination, only presence. I don't know what the future holds. None of us do. But I know this. I will not disappear quietly. I will not surrender my voice out of convenience. I will not confuse love with control or silence with peace. Those lessons were hard won, but they are permanent. This story continues not as a warning, but as a reminder to stay awake in your own life, to question what is done in your name, to remember that agency, once exercised, changes everything that follows. And hat is what I did next. I stayed, I spoke, I chose. And that choice reshaped not only my life, but the lives connected to it in ways that will continue long after the shock has faded. I often think about how close I came to losing more than a house and how quietly it could have happened if I had chosen comfort over clarity. That realization stays with me, not as fear, but as vigilance. Life moves forward, routines return, but awareness lingers, shaping every decision I make. I no longer assume good intentions guarantee good outcomes. I verify, I ask, I stay present. Daniel and I continue to build something new, something honest. Our conversations are less frequent but more meaningful. When we speak, we listen. When we disagree, we pause. There is respect now where there was once assumption. He no longer tries to protect me from my own life, and I no longer protect him from the consequences of his choices. That balance feels hard-earned and real. I have learned that dignity is not loud. It does not announce itself or demand recognition. It is steady, consistent, and unwilling to be rushed. Dignity is reading every document with care. It is saying no without apology. It is trusting yourself enough to withstand discomfort. It is understanding that peace built on silence is fragile, while peace built on truth endures. The house stands as it always has, but I walk through it differently now. I notice the floors I once scrubbed after midnight, the corners where memories gather. I am no longer afraid of losing it because I know I would survive without it. That knowledge is freedom. Ownership matters, but self-possession matters more. People still ask what I would do if faced with the same situation again. I tell them I would do exactly what I did. I would pause. I would gather facts. I would choose clarity over reaction. I would respond in a way that aligned with who I am, not who others expect me to be. That alignment is power. If there is a message in all of this, it is simple. Do not disappear inside your own life. Do not let love become an excuse for erasure. Speak while you can. Decide while it is still your choice. And if someone takes that choice from you, reclaim it without apology. I am not defined by betrayal nor by resilience alone. I am defined by what I chose when tested. I chose presence. I chose boundaries. I chose to remain visible, even when it would have been easier to fade. That choice continues to shape my days quietly and completely. The shock was never about the house. It was about the refusal to surrender myself. And that refusal, once made, became permanent. I share the story now not to relive it, but to mark the distance I have traveled since that hospital room. Distance brings perspective. It allows you to see patterns instead of moments, systems instead of accidents. What happened was not random. It was enabled by assumptions that thrive everywhere. Assumptions about age, about authority, about who gets to decide, and who is expected to accept. I'm more attentive now, not suspicious, but aware. Awareness is calm. It is the opposite of paranoia. It is knowing where your documents are, understanding your rights, and trusting your instincts when something feels off. It is recognizing that love should never require you to surrender your agency. My relationship with my son continues to evolve. We are not perfect. We do not pretend this never happened. We let it exist as part of our shared history, a reference point that keeps us honest. When tension appears, we name it. When fear surfaces, we acknowledge it. That openness prevents resentment from taking root. I have also learned to extend grace without abandoning standards. Grace does not mean forgetting. It means allowing growth while remembering lessons. I can care deeply while remaining firm. Those two things are not opposites. They are partners. The world did not end when I asserted myself. Relationships did not collapse. If anything, they clarified. Some became stronger. Some faded. That is the natural result of truth entering spaces built on convenience. I wake each morning grounded in the knowledge that my life is mine. Not because I control everything, but because I participate fully. I ask. I decide. I remain visible. That visibility is not performative. It is internal. It steadies me. Nothing about this resolution is dramatic anymore. It is simply real. And reality, once embraced, is far less frightening than the quiet erosion of self that comes from silence. I move forward with patience and resolve, aware that vigilance is not fear, but respect for my own life. I no longer wait for crises to assert myself. I live openly, clearly, and deliberately, knowing that presence is the greatest safeguard I possess. It keeps me aligned, awake, and unwilling to surrender what I have earned through living. This awareness will remain with me, steady and quiet, shaping every chapter that follows long after the shock has faded and the story has settled into truth. It is enough and it is mine. That certainty is the real inheritance I carry forward. With gratitude, clarity, and enduring self-respect, now and always onward.